Please welcome Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington. Hi, Marnie.
Hi, nice to
Hi
see you
there.
both. And hi, everybody.
Nice to see you.
It's a pleasure to have you on Mod TV to talk about disruption, and and also to talk about your work today, Marnie. How does a philosopher deal with disruption?
I think most people think that life is a pretty smooth thing, but when you're a philosopher, you're aware that even the most simple things and the most everyday things can be quite disruptive and very challenging for all kinds of people. So, your job is to take things that people take for granted and really think about things, not to be a nuisance, but to remind people that a lot of the things that we do are things that we take for granted. So, you can think about it that philosophers are kind of professional disruptors, and that's our job.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, those sort of day-to-day pedestrian things that we might just do out of hand. Sometimes they're things that philosophers are really looking into and struggling with. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, we kind of, it's not to say that life is not difficult or challenging for people, but in many ways we glide through some really ordinary things. And some of those things ought not to be taken for granted because they could be decisions about who's more valuable than other people, or how we should live our lives, or what makes us happy, how the world could be, organized differently economically. So we think about those fundamental questions because they may suit some people really, really well, but they may be intensely disruptive for other people. And in fact, they may be unjust or unfair. And so our job is really to think about the things, the kind of ordinary furniture of life, and think about whether, for instance, the chairs that we sit on, the ideas that we have are comfortable for good reasons or whether they're comfortable for bad reasons. And so that's our job, is to take the things that you might miss. So some philosophers talk about our job being seeing the things on the end of your nose and identifying those things and thinking about exactly. And sometimes it does make you cross-eyed, Sam, I have to say, thinking about those things and figuring out how you can think about those things in a way that might make life fairer or more just or more equitable for people. That's fundamentally what our role is.
And speaking of roles, can you tell us a little bit more about your role at UniSA as well, Marnie?
Yeah, so you get a philosopher and you put her in charge of essentially what's the portfolio of disruption, right? Because if you think about it, research is about backing dreams and ideas and people thinking differently about the world, which is just a phenomenal job. If you could have asked me when I was little, what's the most amazing job that you could have when you grow up? I actually thought when I was really little that reading books all day would be the most exciting job that I can have. And I have a lot of books and I read them. But to be actually looking after people who are really big on dreams and big on ideas because they want a better world, I actually couldn't think of a better job in the world to have, even in really challenging times, to be sitting in this space and seeing people who are thinking about all the challenges that we're dealing with right now and thinking of ways of solving those and addressing them. It's actually a really powerful place to be and a very positive place to be, notwithstanding the tragedies that people, of course, are experiencing day to day right now.
And so, what can the past tell us about how we as a community approach the disruption that has recently been occurring in the world?
Well, the most important thing is not to say to people, we've seen it before and get over it, right? That's a really unempathetic solution because I don't think the world's seen anything quite like this before. And so that's really important to acknowledge that. And for individual people, this has actually been quite tragic, and for their families as well. So we have to acknowledge that whatever happens in history is specific to the people who experience it in that time. But we also note too that this is not the first scale disruption that we've experienced. So I've said a few times that it's people talk a lot about industry 4.0. I like to talk about, history disruption 15,000.0, because as long as humans have actually been trading goods and using language and exchanging ideas with one another, they've been engaging in forms of activity that have been disruptive in positive ways, but have also triggered off negative disruptions. So we've been for 15,000 years hanging around with animals who are vectors for diseases. So that's how long it goes back. We've been engaged in conflict for quite a long time. We've also exchanged goods economically for a long time, and we've exchanged ideas. And so there have been disruptions pretty much continuously for at least 15,000 years, and probably as long as we want to talk about hominids being on the planet. That's not, again, to diminish what people are experiencing now, but when you're an historian, you can see, for instance, that sometimes there's disease that's going to break out, that there will be conflict, that there'll be exchanges of goods, and that people will think of new ideas to make a better world. So it helps you to put that into perspective, and perhaps to provide people with a little bit of comfort and a little bit of advice about how we might navigate quite tricky times now.
Yeah, definitely. When I think of disruption, I don't necessarily think of positive disruption. So that's a good angle to take, especially, I guess, this week as well, that seemingly negative disruption can be positive, just like positive disruption is still disruption.
Yeah, it's interesting when I look about the deep turmoil that's happening in the US this week. I'm thinking about, obviously individual people and their lives being so disrupted. But I think back to, 200, 250 years ago, when people were moved across the globe in order to support an economic circle that was about actually producing cotton and producing sugar and producing tobacco and exporting it across to other places to be manufactured into goods. And how those people were moved to those spaces without their consent, how they're often engaged in slave labour or put into indentured labour. And so the roots of what we're seeing are not light, they're deep, they're tragic, and they're profound. And so the thought that we could just flick our fingers like that and hope it will go away is not right. And the thought that it's happening somewhere else is also a problem too, because Australia was part of that global economy 1750 right through to now, which has seen Indigenous, First Nation and other peoples actually engaged in an economic cycle that's meant that they might have been alienated, left out, or denied their identity. So the roots of what we see now are profound and deep, but it doesn't mean that we can't think through and figure out how to make that world better. But it does require us to acknowledge that what we're seeing is not just what's happening now in one place, that actually it's much deeper than that and much broader than that.
Yeah, wow. That's yes, I definitely
That's a bit
straight
deep,
away,
isn't it, Sam? I'm sorry.
Straight away, I'm with you. It is a very deep right now.
I'm sorry. But like we're a bit of a downer sometimes. We sit and we'll talk, and people go, "That's it. You're not coming back to the party. You've been such a downer. That's it. No more questions."
No, not at all, not at all. We love you at our party, and it's great, and I love these chats. And I guess I did hear someone recently say yeah, that it's not that there's the system's broken. It's just that the system was designed this way. So the system needs to be broken down and rebuilt. So I guess maybe that plays into the idea. What's some of the bigger challenges that you're looking at and considering at the moment?
Yeah, so interesting things like, for instance, how do we enable people to communicate in order to solve problems across boundaries that might serve as fences that we take for granted, right? So to give you a couple of examples, a lot of the way we think about fighting disease is global. So we really want to be able to provide global solutions to distribute medicines and therapeutic solutions. But a lot of our legal frameworks are often national based or nation state based. A lot of the companies will distribute. So in a way, what we've got is a global aspiration, but we've got, a long history of actually dealing on the sub-global. And so that can mean that the ways in which we transport goods or we develop solutions can come down to containers that are much smaller than the global. And so fundamentally, one of our challenges is to say, okay, so what are the fences that prevent ideas and people and solutions from moving? And that can be, for instance, disciplinary boundaries. It can be that people will view that they need some equipment or they don't have some equipment to do their research, can't get on a plane and collaborate at the moment in a way that they wanted to. So there's whole sorts of disruptions and constraints that would come up, and they come up ordinarily, but they come up even more so now, and they're on top of mind for people. And our job is to say, well, the best quality that human beings have, we're profoundly gifted because we're creative. And once you put constraints on humans, we actually figure out ways of busting out of those constraints pretty successfully over time. And I think the thing that helps us to do that the most is our ability to talk with one another. So our power to communicate is probably the most powerful gift that we have, and that brain that powers it and that body that powers it allows us to, not solve things immediately, but humans are very tenacious and very persistent. And if you put walls up in front of them, they will figure out how to break them down or to go around them or how to solve problems. And you look at that over the course of human history and you just see that happening over and over and over again. Now, that's again not to say that individual humans don't encounter incredible obstacles in their lives and tragic ones as well. But if you look at humanity as a whole, we do bust down fences over and over and over again. So the pandemic has thrown up a lot of fences for people. but it's also busted down some fences for some researchers as well. And they are saying, okay, so this could allow me to do some things that would mean that I could address some of those very broad impacts of COVID in some quite positive ways. Okay.
Yeah, and what sneaks up on you sometimes, and maybe makes things more complicated or less complicated than you thought they might be?
Oh, Sam, life sneaks up on you constantly as a philosopher and makes things more complicated. It just is profound. You'll be sitting. So I'm a metaphysician by training, which sounds a bit kind of, dibsy on yourself, a metaphysician. So I'm not a doctor and I don't cure anything. And if there were a plane emergency where they call for a doctor, I would not be the person that you call up because I might confuse things more than solve them. But my job is to think about the kind of rules that help the world to make sense. So if you were inventing a new world, Sam, would you have left and right? Could you have a world without those things? Could you have a world with up and down? And could you have a world with before and after? So my job is to think about how important those rules are, what those rules are, how important they are, how they stick together in kind of constellations. And I use histories as a way of identifying those rules because when people write histories, they don't just write about the past, they're actually telling you about the rules of the world as it is now. So I can, as a philosopher, trip over some very basic things like saying, so what is before and after? Which sounds like I'm a bit slow, but actually these are really, really important questions because, for instance, for some Aboriginal communities, they think about before and after quite differently from us. They don't think of after as coming in front. They might think about it in different ways. So my job is to be stopped short quite a lot by sometimes some very, very simple things, but that's my job, is to try and help think about those fundamental rules.
And what's your favorite rule to break then? Mm.
Oh, look, all of them, Sam, to be honest with you. Seriously. I'm a left-hander. So I love, I live in a predominantly, you talk about disruption, I live in a predominantly right-handed world. So door handles, really simple things. I mean, that might help some of your watchers and listeners to think about it. We put up with these things over and over again. Scissors that don't work, vegetable peelers that I have to hold in strange ways, that I figure out how to do that. I, learned to play right-handed in cricket. I've learned to play right-handed in other sports. I've just learned to adapt to that. But being a left-hander is actually a bit disruptive, to be honest with you. That's one of the ones that I like the most because this is the hand that writes with a pen. And that left hand can be quite powerful sometimes. So that's one I quite like, is whether the world is divided into left and right, and how many species other than humans might be handed like us is a really interesting question. Some of them are, but most aren't. So it's interesting that humans have handedness as a kind of distinctive thing, which seems a long way from the pandemic, to be honest with you. But there's lots of rules that are kind of being broken at the moment that I find really, really interesting. And the thing I love is figuring out which of those broken rules enable researchers to help break through other rules to change the world for the better.
It's really interesting talking about being left-handed, because I automatically, my dad is left-handed, and growing up, he's a boomer. They weren't allowed to be left-handed. Like left-handed was seen as lesser, as weaker. So he would get the switch if ever he wrote with his left hand. So his upbringing is quite heavily influenced by that, where now he doesn't, like, sometimes he will be like, I don't know which hand I'm actually writing with now. So yeah, it's not just, this is my left hand. It goes so much like deeper in society and our culture and everything as well.
Right. So that's a pretty light example. There's a lot, and I can say, in the time that your dad went to school, between then and now, things have changed enough that he can now write with his left hand. But we can, all of us, think of actually other rules that have been rewritten since that time. For instance, around the recognition of the rights of Black people globally, Aboriginal Australians. It's unfinished business, but there have been changes. Marriage equality. We can all think of examples where things that might have been thought about quite differently 50 years ago, 40 years ago, have changed. And the world has kind of rewrote the rules somewhat. Not always perfectly, because the other thing is this is a left-handed woman. And so there's other rules in that space as well. And so your job as a philosopher is not to think about the rules as being these very abstract things that don't sit in earth and come to earth and don't get tangled with politics and mean that life is just very simple for all of us. It's not. We all crazily go through every single day of our lives navigating lots of unwritten rules. And we do so really pretty seamlessly. But as I say, for some people, those rules are incredible barriers. And sometimes those rules are barriers because of their health conditions, and sometimes those rules are because of their identity. And our job as researchers is to, in so many different ways, whether it's in a laboratory or using your brain or writing creative works, making creative works, is to think through and say that constraint is actually not a constraint. Could we revisit that? Could we think about this differently? And so the left-hander example is, I think, a nice one. It's quite simple for people, but as I say, there's so many things around us that are like that. The question for a philosopher is, which are the most important ones? And for me, at the moment, are things like, how do we make sure that our economy and our society are such that most people have meaningful work, that they can participate in ways that they're really proud of and that they feel that they've got meaningful work? So how do we think about what makes that possible? What education, what skills and what research would make that possible for them? How do we make sure that people who have underlying health conditions can be supported and helped? How do we make sure that people that are experiencing mental health challenges, that they can be helped? So how do we think about the constraints that are holding back solutions to those problems, and how can we address them? It doesn't mean we always fix them, but the thing is, I'm really am in charge of a portfolio of dreams, and I don't want to put them down, but researchers are just class A dreamers. They're fabulous dreamers, and that's not to say or to deprecate who they are. Their job is to bounce back and to think of big dreams and actually to change the world. And some of the things they think of are mind-blowing in terms of changing the world. The fact that we're streaming and we're using Wi-Fi originated from some people dreaming, which I think is just the most amazing thing. So yeah, I'm a portfolio of dreamers, but in the most positive way.
No, it definitely sounds like it as well. So what do you hope that people will take away from the work that you're doing?
They take a lot from the work that we do across the board. So there's what they take away from my personal work, but let's talk about the research community that works with me. What they take away from that, I hope, are creations of new kinds of jobs, opportunities for skills for their families and for them, better health treatments. That would mean that they live longer and better lives, access to education. That will make probably the single biggest difference to the welfare of them and their family. The invention of new products that mean, for instance, that we can move information or we can move goods around, or that we can produce goods more safely. But also ways of thinking about helping people that are that are vulnerable, how we can look after them better. And for South Australia and for people locally in Kaurna country, how do we recognise and respect Kaurna culture and weave that into, learn from that in the way we think about environment, the way we think about economy? How can we draw positively on that? But also, how do we help South Australian businesses and communities to thrive and to flourish in really, really positive ways? It runs the whole gamut, Lee. So, in my job, one moment I'll be talking to people that work on the development of surfaces that are antimicrobial to prevent people from getting infections. The next minute I'll be talking to people that work on mental health. The next minute I'll be talking with people that are working to protect children from harm. And then the very next minute I'll be working again with people that are inventing new ways of sending rockets up into space. And that's probably just in the space of an hour and a half every day. So, I might have 12 to 14 meetings a day, and every single one of those meetings could involve research from the sciences through to the creative arts. And it pretty much covers the whole gamut of humanity. And that's probably why I love my job so much, because philosophers are also just fundamentally curious.
So
how does it affect us across the board? Yeah.
Yeah. And this next question might be, I'm interested in your answer. So what's the key question we should be asking going forward? So taking all of that and someone's coming along, they start.
The key question is, what does a better world look like? Yeah. Because I think we would all like to sign up for a world where we get respected for whom we are as individuals and as groups. We'd like to sign up for a world where people live longer and healthier lives, where people do have access to education, that they have access to the food they need, the water they need, the cures that they need. So, yeah, what would make a better world? It sounds pretty simple, but you unpack that, that's like Pandora's box, isn't it? It's full of so many opportunities. And as I say, the tricky thing is figuring out which ones are the best questions. But the great thing about hanging around lots of researchers, they're really, really clever. So they can hone in on great questions pretty quickly. And that curiosity just fuels them. And that tenacity means that they just hone in and they ask great questions time and time again.
And as you and your colleagues, you're at the forefront, philosophers at the forefront of this this deep thinking and questioning. and often coming up with possible solutions. How do you deal with it when these possible solutions, suggestions, um, are really it's quite slow for them to be taken up by those who can take up those solutions? How do you
Mm.
wrestle with that?
Yeah, look, we talk a lot about human-centered design at the moment. So the notion of user-friendly design, human-centered design, all of these concepts are reaching for the notion that we build things for people. Okay, it's so, there's the old saying, you build it and people will come. That's the wrong way around. The thing is, the solutions and the research that we have to be designed with people in mind. And so a philosopher can sit abstractly, but I do a lot of my work with school teachers so that I'm testing my ideas all the time and saying, is this going to be helpful for people in the way that we teach history, in the way that we help young people to think, for instance, the difference between histories that are hate histories or denial histories versus ones where people are really trying for best endeavour to do good work. How do we teach young people to do that? So you're testing your ideas. And the good thing about being a DVC and working with researchers, you see people don't just invent ideas in a box and hold them in a black box. What they do is their ideas come from community and they come from business that stimulate them to think about things in different ways. But then what they do is they're testing those ideas with community and with business over and over and over again, so that the solutions are actually ones that you feel like you've actually developed together and are ones that people will adopt because they felt that those were the right things to do. So it's sometimes it's a bit distressing when you read about research. People have a really good rational idea, but it doesn't work because people don't want to adopt it. And you think that's a real shame, and you wonder whether people and communities were engaged in the development of the design. And the beautiful thing about the research that happens at my university is that people don't do the research without the community and the business in mind. They sit down and they say, okay, what's the problem? How do we help you? How can we refine this idea with you? And go through that process. And, and mod plays an important part in that too, because you're testing our ideas, giving us feedback, helping us to refine and think, okay, how do we explain this? What really is the problem? Because sometimes we think we might have the problem or the answer, and the community says, no, you're wrong. It's actually this. And you go, okay, you're right. We need to actually recalibrate. So you refine over time what your questions are. And as I say, you work closely with other people in order to make sure that what you develop is fair and right and going to be seen as good things to do by that community.
Yeah, wow. Well, it sounds like that's a very in-depth process. And you're having 14 to 17 meetings a day. But what's the next big thing for you? What are you about to work on or thinking about?
Yeah, so we have a few big things coming for the university community, and I've got a few things that I'm writing about too. But for the university community, a couple of big things are, how do we figure out ways of, for instance, I'll give you a couple of examples. How do we figure out ways of working with businesses more effectively so they don't have to run around for the solutions? So how do we, make our inquiry management? How do we work with businesses in a way that's really wrapping around them and helping them to find solutions more quickly so that they don't have to navigate the university website quite as much and figure out who's who in the university community to get the answers that they need. So how can we do that more effectively? Because we're conscious that a lot of businesses now need rapid answers to questions, and we don't want to be slow. We want to be able to help people as quickly and fairly as we can. So how do we adjust and make that possible? And, the exciting thing for me is the space of mod. There's been a lot of discussion in the university. A lot of the technological advancements that we have and a lot of the medical advancements we have come with some really interesting ethical questions. And I don't mean that they're bad things, they're just interesting questions. And mod has always been a space where we felt that we could explore some of those questions with our community and get their advice about how we might think about those things. So that's the other big frontier for us is, we know we're interested in particular sectors, agriculture, tourism, space, defence, all of those things are interesting and powerful. But the sector that crosses across all of those is the trust sector. So how do we think about privacy? How do we think about people's rights? How do we think about what are the right things to do with the power of the research that we have? And we have strong ethical navigation systems, but it's just wonderful to engage, particularly with young people, and ask them, how are you navigating these challenges? Because they're inspirational for us too. So those are two examples at the moment of what the university is doing. And for me personally, my next book is on whether machines can write histories. So is it only humans that can write histories, or can machines write them? So I'm pretty interested in that question.
sounds really, really interesting as well, because I think definitely 2020 is going to be interesting in the future history books. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the human interpretation is. If a machine
Yeah, that's
can
going to be
look
the
at the
machine
paper.
interpretation, exactly. And you've already got that. You've got chatbots and you've got, AI scrapers that are, presenting news for us. So we already have machines. And, I always say to people, when we turn on Netflix or any streaming service and it make recommendations to you, it's actually a history service. It's making a judgment on the basis of lots of people's histories about what you want to do. Now, 2020 is such an interesting year, Lee, because I bet in 1348 people were saying this year is not going very well at all. There's this major plague that's going on across Europe. It's terrible. And there were 10 waves of plague that travelled through Europe from that time. And, I bet they didn't think that well of that year either. But interestingly enough, that time generated some powerful innovations in the movement of information around printing and the way people thought about collecting work and disseminating work. So again, while I wouldn't want to deny the tragedy of what people are experiencing, I'm already beginning to see people think of really clever ways to navigate. And this streaming television program is an example of that, right? So think about it. You're a physical space, but you've moved pretty quickly into the digital realm and you're interviewing me today, which shows me that you're an incredibly creative and resilient group. So you proved my point about humans.
And our use of machinery.
And our use of machinery for good, right? For good, which is excellent. Yeah.
The force of good. Yeah, exactly. Now, Marnie, if people are wanting to find out more about you, about your work, where's the best place for us to go looking?
Yeah, so you can find me if you look at the UniSA website, so UNISA. I have a really long name, Lee, so, Marnie, M-A-R-N-I-E. And in Ghana, of course, Nina Marnie means how you're going. It's a beautiful phrase. I'm so thrilled to be living in country that has those beautiful words. But if you find my name, M-A-R-N-I-E, and UniSA, there's actually, I've discovered there's a few Marnies at UniSA, which I'm pretty excited about. And they've all been very kind. When they've received emails on my behalf, they've pushed them through to me. So if you type in Marnie, you'll probably find I'm the one with the longest name, Hughes-Warrington. Find me. You can find my page. You can find out a bit more about my work. But you could also just go to the UniSA homepage, and we've only got 3 buttons. And one of those big buttons is research. So if you just click on that big button, research, it'll give you some stories about some of the things we've been doing, for instance, during COVID. So our drone that's able to monitor body temperature with people, the work we've been doing with mental health, with communities, with parents to support them in homeschooling. You'll find a whole range of stories around business growth, ranging from technology, mask testing to allow people to have safe PPE, all kinds of things. You'll be able to go and find some stories, and I bet you'll find at least one that you'll find really, really interesting. And hopefully you'll view it as a really helpful response to COVID.
Well, thank you so much, Marnie, for joining us on the show today. It's been great chatting with you, and I wish we had a little bit longer.
Well, look, every philosopher wishes to have a dinner conversation that just goes on for decades, but it can wear a bit thin when you say she's just lots of questions and not many answers. So I have to thank you both for being incredibly patient with this philosopher, and what a privilege it is to be able to appear on TV. And I hope it's interesting for people, and I hope they've learned a little bit more about my work, but also the work of the research portfolio at UniSA.
Well, we definitely have, and thanks again, and the pleasure has been all ours. So thank you so much, Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington.
Thank you, and see you all.